James Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud to stand here today as critic and as representative of the voters of my riding. This is a bill to put in measures to prevent erosion of the tax base. But when I look at this bill, my question is, who and where is the plan to put an end to tax loopholes? When I look at the situation for Canadians, for workers all over Canada, Canadians pay their fair share. But big business, the 1% Liberals' friends, they're able to use tax havens, and this is not acceptable. Tax havens are preventing our economy from developing in a fair and equitable way.
I want to talk about this conversation we've been having this morning where the Liberals talk about tax fairness and closing loopholes, and I don't often agree with the Liberal Party, but I will say that they have been very committed to closing tax loopholes. It's just they're not committed to closing them on the friends of the Liberal Party. What they've been doing is using the massive resources of the CRA to go after single moms, to go after young families, to go after small businesses. And we see one of the great and, I think, really disturbing political frauds of the last few years is that this government says again and again and again their commitment to getting the money to young families through the child tax benefit. But what they don't say is they're clawing that money back through a whole series of measures that are actually cruel in their implementation and targeting people who have no capacity to defend themselves. Now, we can just do a few comparisons to show how unfair this system is in terms of how they look after the friends of the Liberal Party. So let's talk about the need to deal with the tax avoidance system. The problem of the super rich not paying their part has a massive impact on the erosion of our economy and our ability to make investments, to build an economy that is fair, that is just across this country. We're learning now anywhere that the tax avoidance is upwards of anywhere of $3 billion a year, but there may be anywhere from $70 billion to $240 billion being held offshore, out of access to the Canada Revenue Agency. And what is Canada Revenue Agency's response to such massive tax avoidance? Well, we saw how this government made a deal with KPMG. After it was found out that KPMG was involved in establishing what was called scams, that if you had $5 million, to blow, now not many people out there in television land probably have $5 million to spare, but if you're friends of the Liberal Party, more likely you are that you may have. So you could set them up in offshore tax havens. That's cheating. And, when a small business in my region gets caught out not paying their taxes, the government brings the full weight of the law down on them. There is no mercy. I've never seen mercy from the CRA ever. And if you're not paying your taxes, that's the way it's got to be. But why would the government make an agreement? Why would this Prime Minister make an agreement with KPMG? People who are tied to the Liberal Party, people who are tied to getting federal contacts, to give them an amnesty for avoiding taxes. That doesn't happen, Mr. Speaker, if you're a single mom and you got an overpayment on your EI. Let's talk about Stephen Brofman, very close friend of the Prime Minister. He's their top fundraiser. In fact, he's so good at raising funds, he helped raise $250,000 in 2 hours for the Liberal Party. I mean, they just travel in different circles than the rest of us Canadians do. So when Stephen Brofman gets named in the Panama Papers, you would think that that would be a really serious question of the legitimacy of the friends of this Prime Minister and the need to deal with tax loopholes and unfairness. But the Prime Minister came out and said immediately, hey, there is no investigation needed. He's a friend of mine. And you know what? No investigation happened. Now, my young daughter, who just started work, who makes minimum wage, is getting her second audit. She got audited last year. She's getting her second audit. I say get used to it. When you're a young student, you're working single, you're just trying to pay your rent, you might get audited by the CRA all manner of times. But I would never call the CRA and say, hey, she's my daughter, she doesn't need to get audited. That would never happen. But the Prime Minister went public and said, Stephen Brockman's a good guy. He doesn't need to get audited. When he's named in the Paradise Papers. And it never happened. Well, who else was named in it? Well, there was Leo Cobbler. Now, this was about the trust that was set up for the Cobbler family. Now, Leo, if you don't know, if you're not part of the Laurentian class, well, he's a Liberal senator, and he's also a very well-placed Liberal bagman. He was named in this. Paul Martin got named, but I guess that shouldn't be surprising. I mean, Paul Martin made his name keeping his ships offshore so he didn't have to pay taxes. So Paul Martin got named in the Paradise Papers. Jean Chrétien got named in the Paradise Papers. And then, of course, we have the finance minister, who had, Morneau Chappelle had their Bahamas subsidiary. Now, what would you be going to the Bahamas for? One of the most notorious tax havens. Of course, there's lots of tax work to do down there. And Morneau Chappelle had their subsidiary in the Bahamas. So when we see this government come forward and say they're going to take special measures to deal with the Bahamas, set up with the finance minister, does anybody in any place in this country think they're going to be looking after the little guy? I don't think so. Now, we have the Minister of Infrastructure. It just keeps going on and on and on. The Minister of Infrastructure, a report in the Journal de Montréal about the transfer of payments of shareholders through a company in the, wait for it, the Turks and Caicos. Now, for my folks back home who work at the mill, who work at the mine, who work at Tim Hortons, they may wonder, why would someone have shares in the Turks and Caicos? Where is that anyways? Well, you know, it is well known for offshore finance operations. So we have the Minister of Infrastructure. Maybe we'll be talking, if we have enough time, about the privatized infrastructure bank that they're set up. I bet a lot of people from the Turks and Caicos will be very interested. Now, it's not just being mean to the Liberals. We could talk about the famous Nicole Eaton, senator, who, when they released a bunch of documents from the notorious Bahamas, it turned out that she was a director of a corporation called Mount Bowden Limited, and she says she has no idea how she was named as a director of this corporation. That stuff happens to me all the time, Mr. Speaker. You know, I just find out I'm director of a corporation, Bahamas, shrug, shrug, shrug. How did that happen? I guess it's the world that they're traveling in. Now let's go going back to the illustrious upper chamber. Of course, we couldn't have this discussion about offshore tax havens without talking about Liberal Senator Panna Merchant. Wow. It said that her husband moved, quote, nearly $2 million to secretive financial havens while he was locked in a battle with the Canada Revenue Agency. And she gets paid till she's 75 by the Canadian taxpayers to represent our interests. Now, what happens is really interesting, Mr. Speaker. When rich people like these move assets around outside the hands of the CRA, what happens? Well, nothing happens. And that speaks to the fundamental problem that we're seeing, the unfairness. Because ordinary Canadians pay their fair share of taxes. They work really hard. They are diligent, and they pay their fair share. So when we see the super rich and the friends of the Laurentian and Liberal class not paying their share, we have a problem. So now, lest you think, Mr. Speaker, that the CRA is just the most relaxed, laid-back organization, they just don't like making life difficult for anybody over taxes, let's give you an example of what happens if you're not super rich. Let's talk about what happens if you're working poor and how you get treated. And let's talk about the Canada Child Tax Benefit, because again, the great fraud that is being perpetrated by this government day in, day out is this great miracle of the child tax benefit that everyone gets and it brings everyone out of poverty. But what they don't say is after they make those announcements, they put the resources of the Canada Revenue Agency to claw it back. And the vast majority of cases that are coming through my office, and I've talked to many members of Parliament, the vast majority of cases that are coming through right now are single moms who are being denied their child tax benefit because of the loopholes that they're being forced to jump through. So what are some of those loopholes? Well, there was a young father came into my office. The wife left town, left him with the kids. He didn't know where she went. He had to quit his job to look after these little children. He got cut off from his child tax benefits because he couldn't prove where she was. Well, she left. He didn't know where she was. At Christmas time, the neighbors were putting together food hampers for them because they had nothing. I have a young couple that were denied. It's not just single moms, a young couple. Told in the middle after they were getting the funds, suddenly they had to now go back and prove who they were, what they were married, even where the children were, even though they've always had their children. We have single moms being told that they're being cut off because they can't prove that they have their children. They say, well, the children go to the local school. They won't accept the report cards anymore. That's not fair. You would make a single mom go through those kind of loopholes when you wouldn't make Stephen Brofman. There's a wonderful young mother I know, a young Cree mother who has the most beautiful little girl, and in 6 years that mother has never received any child tax benefit. Why? Because the government says they don't believe that she actually lives in the country. Well, she's not living in the Turks and Caicos. She's living in social housing, and she's working, and she's raising her child, and she's not getting a single dime from this government. And they're saying, well, you got to go to the doctor. You got to go to the dentist. That's not good enough. Then you got to go to the landlord. They even told her to go to the mailman to get him to sign to say where she lived. She's paid her taxes every single year. We have mothers who have no proper housing, so they're couch surfing. When they're couch surfing, CRA says, well, your address is you're staying with your folks. We're cutting you off. They will use all manner of hoops to make single moms jump through, but they wouldn't make anybody who's named in the Panama Papers go through that. Now, one of the other things they've come up with is to get your child tax benefit, they say, well, it's really simple. Just show us proof of the insurance that you have on your place and the insurance that you have on your children. Insurance? The people that I represent, single moms, coming out of poverty, don't have insurance. Now, I guess if you're the finance minister and you can't remember that you own a chateau in the south of France, you probably think it's great. Let's just find out what their insurance is. I mean, what kind of idiotic loophole is this? Telling a poor mother, if she could just prove that she's got insurance for her kids, well, maybe we'll give it to you. Well, if she had insurance, she probably wouldn't be so desperate to get the child tax benefits. Now, Mr. Speaker, we see that this government talks about the middle class and those wanting to join them. You know, if it was a Liberal drinking game and the Prime Minister got up and gave a speech, you'd be bombed after the first 5 minutes if you had to respond every time he said the middle class and those wanting to join him. And I just want to put on the record, and I don't want to be mean to the Prime Minister, but I think him and I grew up in different middle classes. Because when I was young and starting out and working, my wife and I started a small business. And we barely made ends meet, but we paid our taxes, we paid our employees, and we worked really hard. So I was really surprised when the Prime Minister talked about small business in the 2015 election. He said most of these, he was worried that they were being used as millionaire tax dodges. Now, I was 2 terms on the Chamber of Commerce, on the Tri-Town Chamber of Commerce in Northern Ontario. I did not know anyone sitting around that table who were there because they were establishing millionaire tax dodges. Small businesses are the backbone, and people work really hard. And it seemed to me such a disconnect that the Prime Minister would say, well, you know, we have to watch these small businesses because they're millionaire tax dodges. But then, of course, he would know because he set up 3 numbered companies to handle his income, his investments, and also the money that he was getting as a Member of Parliament to do public speaking, so it would lower his tax rate. So, of course, from his perspective, everybody else must be doing this. But no, Mr. Speaker, other people are not doing this. So what do we need to do? We need to start addressing tax fairness in a coherent manner. We need a review of the overall tax system that was set up. Last time I think it was reviewed was in the 60s. We are in a very different world now in terms of tax avoidance, in terms of corporations not paying their share, of more and more the cost of social services and that being downloaded onto municipalities and onto single households and people who pay, in the middle class, who pay a very good chunk of taxes. So we need, number one, an overview of the tax system. We need a real clear sense of where tax avoidance is happening. And I was really surprised to see that this government fought so hard against the parliamentary budget officer over the simple question of starting to be able to identify where the tax bleeding is happening. Because if we see where the tax bleeding is happening, we can start to make changes. And then we need to see a government that will spend more time going after the super billionaires who are hiding their money in the Turks and Caicos than they are going after single mums. That should be a fundamental question and principle that all people in this House, regardless of their political ideology, agree with. That young people and single moms and young families who are trying to get by, they shouldn't have to go through the kind of burdens that CRA is putting on them as though they were criminals for the fact that they are entitled to this money. And we should be putting those resources into actually tracking and going after tax havens. And those who do use tax havens, corporations, Mr. Speaker, there has to be some kind of punishment. There has to be, at the federal level, for example, KPMG, we have to start saying, if you use international tax havens, if you are found guilty of not paying your fair share, then you're going to be disallowed from having federal contracts for a period of, say, 5 years. That would send a message that we're serious, because many companies in this country, they play by the rules. Many companies do everything that is asked of them and more to make sure that they're compliant. So for the ones and the outliers who aren't, they should not be rewarded for the incentive of shipping resources offshore to avoid their basic responsibility, which is to ensure that we have a tax system that works so that we can make the investments that are needed, so that we can grow a more fair economy, a more just economy, and an economy where people can live the kind of lives that they deserve in this country. And a coherent tax policy is important. So, you know, as much as I'm okay with the fact that we're going to sign a bunch of tax agreements with a bunch of countries, that's all right. But I want to see that when are we going to start getting serious about going after these tax havens and the Canadians who are using them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.